The audience has always been a well-known term in communication research. In fact, pioneers in the field of research have used it as the collective word to indicate the receivers in the simple sequential model of the mass communication process, namely the source, channel, message, receiver and effect. There is also established material which defines audience as readers, viewers or listeners of one or another media channel, or of this or that type of content or performance. This is Amrita, and today we are going to analyze the mass media audience and its importance to mass communication. Audience is also a word that has been agreed upon, conceptually at least, and used liberally by theorists and media practitioners alike when talking about the receivers of information or entertainment. It has also entered into our daily usage. We, as the media public, consider it as an unambiguous description of ourselves. The audience has been an object of inquiry for different reasons. Most primarily because knowledge about the audience is an essential tool for communicators and media organizations. Media organizations collect and use information about the audience for their accounting and planning. Also important is the fact that the study of audience is necessary for studying media effects. Information about the audience is also essential to research feedback and evaluation. In fact, the definition of a media audience depends greatly on our viewpoint about the function of communication in society. If, for instance, we look upon communication as an article of trade or as a product and the media as a tool for selling that commodity, a media audience then would be no better than a potential market for products and services.
Has been reinvented with fiber actives to repair damage at the heart of hair, so you can keep doing things to your hair.
On the other hand, if we consider communication to be for social good and for public service, then the media audience ideally should be a participative and a dialogic community, with the media serving the educational, informational and cultural needs of the community. But if communication is seen as a tool for persuasion and propaganda to promote certain political, religious or moral views, then a media audience is the masses that need to be indoctrinated. Not surprisingly, in the light of this variety of motive, audience has many differences of meaning and conflicts of view. One reason for difficulty in defining the word audience is that the audience for most mass media is not strictly knowable at all. It cannot be directly observed, so the term audience has an abstract and debatable character. Though it is a pawn in the media game, it does not really have an identifiable social identity with specific recordable characteristics. A media audience is unlike, say, for example, the audience for a street performance, a theatre show, a mela, a political show, or a lecture.
Raymond Williams has a very interesting take wherein he says that there are no masses, only ways of looking at people as masses. Why is this important when we talk of audiences? Because the primary feature that people associate with audiences is that they are masses, large in numbers, and are associated with consuming a certain form of mass media. Now, in itself, an audience is determined and defined in relation to the kind of media product that they consume, that they talk of, and perhaps contribute to in terms of feedback, etc. Now, the idea of audiences has been debated since the emergence of the mass media market. And that is because the moment we had radio, we had television, we were no longer talking of one to few, but one to many. And who were these many? How could they be reached? What would be their impact? And how would their preferences and tastes then change what artists produce, what filmmakers create, and what news channels broadcast? That essentially became the reason why people started talking of specialized audiences across geographic boundaries who were consuming certain kinds of media. and that in itself becomes the audiences.
Sociologists like to define the audience here as a conventionalized crowd assembled together. But a media audience is much more than that. The media audience is no doubt also a collective, but of a very different kind. The audience here is an aggregate of persons who are readers, viewers and listeners of different media and their various components. But this aggregate or collective may not necessarily be collected at the same place or even at the same time while attending to some component of the media. Modern technology allows the media audience to attend to their media at their leisure. This audience has come together in the common act of reading, watching or listening and not due to time and space. According to Martin Aller, professor of communication studies, the audience exists nowhere. It inhabits no real space, only a place within analytical discourses. It seems that the audience is now a little more than a metaphor drawn from another context, that of the theatre and live performance, which bears little relation to the diverse realities of modern communication media. The origins of the present-day audience for mass media has its roots in public theatres, nautankies, jatras and musical performances that were played out as part of entertainment in ancient times. Audience were also the public spectators at games and other spectacles that the public enjoyed in those early days. Greek and Roman cities would have an arena or amphitheatre for such purpose. The significance of the Greco-Roman invention lies in the fact that it pioneers numerous features of present-day media audiences, namely, the planning and organization of the viewing and listening, the public character of the planned events, the secular content of performance and display. The main purpose here was entertainment, enjoyment and education, the voluntary and individual acts of choice involved in attending. As per this view, the audience as a set of spectators for public events of a secular kind was already institutionalized more than 2000 years ago, with its own customs, expectations and rules about the time, place and content of performances, conditions for entry, etc. It was a typically urban phenomenon, often with a commercial basis and with different contexts based on differences of class and status. The audience was one element in a larger institution which included professional writers, performers, producers and entrepreneurs. The phenomenon of public entertainment and display attracted sponsorship, could serve political ends and was an object of public surveillance. Several features nevertheless distinguished the early form of audience from the modern media equivalent. Most important is the fact that the original audience was localized in one place and time. They were the occupants of the auditorium, the space in which they could see and hear what was going on. Their interlocutors spoke directly to them, and performance was always live and open to view. This means that the audience was always relatively small and potentially active within itself and interactive with performers. The original audience had a potential collective life of its own. These same conditions still prevail in many circumstances of public display and spectatorship, in theatres, stadiums, racetracks, etc. So, the audience that we identify as media audience is not merely a continuous development from the past, but the social invention of a new variant, which overlaps with the earlier audience and borrows its name, sometimes with misleading results. Media audience, or as a term indicating a certain kind of audience, began with the invention of the printed book, and along with it, the development of a reading public. The printing of books began sometime in the 15th century and soon went on to an organized distribution system wherein books, even of a general category, could be bought by individuals. These books could be used by the general public for their entertainment, education and instruction. By the late 16th century, this reading public had grown, and it was safe to identify them as a set of people who were keen to buy and read and collect books for their personal collection. Such publics were normally based in urban cities and states bound by a certain social class and language, and supported by a burgeoning group of publishers and printers.
Traditional audiences versus audiences of mass media are defined primarily by the idea that traditional audiences sometimes were defined by the performance or the communication that was being transacted. So if you had folk culture and you had the performance of a dance, or you had theatre and you had members of the community participating in it, this form of communication was ritualistic. It also contributed to the perpetuation of that community, and therefore traditional audiences were much closer to and much closely involved with the production of that form of expression. However, when we talk of mass audiences, we are talking of audiences which are separated from the producer, sometimes by many miles, sometimes by even oceans. So this difference of distance becomes an important marker. Secondly, traditional audiences may have had a say by virtue of being physically closer or being producers of the content themselves in the flow of the direction. However, in the case of mass audiences, feedback has to be formally initiated. There is no way of the audience talking back unless the format necessitates that. So traditional audiences essentially talk of closer and more folk forms, whereas mass communication and mass audiences talk of distances, talk of the feasibilities of feedback subject to contexts.
Between the 16th and the 19th century, the reading public gradually and slowly grew even more and became identifiable as a group who would read books and follow authors of their choice and chosen subjects. In fact, in the 18th century, periodicals, magazines and newspapers also joined printed books and created their own patrons. Soon, this print media industry, now large and ramifying, saw control and censorship. Also, because printing had not yet become cheap, the reading public had to carefully choose what they wanted to pick up, and hence there were now divisions and classifications based on content, genres and categories of readers. The use of the term audience referring to these different sets of readers will not be completely inappropriate considering their shared choices of reading matter and intellectual preference, even though they did not share the same physical space. It was now possible to belong to an audience for a certain topic or for a particular author, even though they may not be sharing the same social group or location. This view of audience was soon made obsolete by a series of changes in technology and society, especially by the great increase in urban population, improved land communication and literacy. The 19th century witnessed huge revolutionary changes both in terms of technology and in the social fabric of society. By the end of the century, the small world of book and periodical production had transformed into large conglomerates and industries serving the burgeoning population. These newly founded media industries sought to recruit and shape audiences according to their interests and end motives. This new development in turn fueled the growth of a paying public, an audience or a collection of people who could be defined by their preferences and socio-economic standing. A new consumer market was coming into play. The invention of cinema and film brought about another changing point in the concept of audience. The moving picture or cinema, as shown in halls, brought together the public for the first time under one roof and created the first genuine mass audience. This mass audience also devalued the term public and ushered in the concept of mass media distinct from the title of live theatre audience. Although it could not directly interact with the performer, yet in some ways the film audience constituted an active crowd. The main difference from the theatre was that there was no live performance and that the show was always the same wherever it was shown. Cinema also allowed much greater possibility for very many people to share much the same experience as a spectator, cutting across boundaries of time and space. Modern society and its behavior laid the groundwork in which the audience could be placed as an example of a new form of collectivity, made possible by the conditions of modern societies. The term theorist Herbert Blumer used to describe this kind of an audience was mass, which he differentiated from older social forms, namely the group, the crowd and the public. The large number of people who are supposed to make up the mass come from all walks of life. They are therefore a heterogeneous group or groups with little interaction among themselves. They are anonymous to each other. In fact, they are anonymous to even the creator. The only thing that binds them is the medium and the message. We can define them as the mass media audience. But this is again a definition that is very imprecise. A mass audience is larger than an audience for, say, a lecture or a concert or a theatre. But what about a mass rally addressed by a political leader in an Indian city? Hence, the term mass is riddled with dichotomies. It only becomes intelligible when used in a particular context and is related to a certain kind of behavior and structure. It is in fact a flexible epithet devoid of any precise scientific proof and more likely to reveal the point of view of the person using it than to clarify the phenomenon in question. A mass media audience is therefore a very large audience that is the creation of the modern electronic mass media. It is the result of a new technology that is directed at mass production and wide dissemination of communication. The exact size of the audience which defines as mass is not a given, but it has to definitely be larger than possibly the audience at a lecture or play. And also it has to be large in relation to the number of communicators. This kind of an audience was unknown prior to the age of electronics. As Maxwell writes, this kind of an audience is an aggregate of individuals united by a common focus of interest, engaging in an identical form of behavior and open to activation towards common ends. Yet the individuals are unknown to each other, have only a restricted amount of interaction, do not orient their actions to each other and are only loosely organized or lacking in organization. The composition of the audience is continuously shifting. It has no leadership or feelings of identity. This concept of the mass audience was more an ideal type rather than the actual reality, possibly an accentuation of characteristics likely to be found under the conditions of mass production and large-scale distribution of news and entertainment. In a world where much value was placed on association, relationships and personal identity, this concept of mass audience almost had a derogatory suggestion, in which individuals are seen to be characterless and under the influence of the mass mediums.
Before we talk about the idea of what a mass audience is in greater detail, we must look at the features of a mass audience. Now, a mass audience in a socialist paradigm is a very positive association because it talks of large numbers. However, in a critical paradigm, you may tend to say that these numbers do not matter because their feedback or the fact that there is a standardization takes away individuality. So, Commonly to both these paradigms is the idea of numbers. So mass audiences need to be large in number. Secondly, they may be separated through large distances from the producer or from the space of production or even from the area of broadcast, and may use different forms of mass communication, whether it is radio, television, print, news, etc., to be able to consume the texts and the messages that are being produced. Thirdly, there is standardized content that is sent out to audiences. Now, in the contemporary world, the standardized content is sometimes criticized, or people say that the content may not necessarily reach people in the same format. For example, you may see a cricket match in India live, and you may see a relay of the cricket match in another country much later. But the act of relays to television would mean that you and I are both televised audiences, and therefore there are certain forms and means through which we consume that medium that are common to us, irrespective of where we are from. And so the time lag may be a very small component of this larger fact, which is to say that there is a ways and means and a certain kind of technology through which we are consuming this mass media.
In fact, such very national mass media audience exists in the countries of the developed world, but have yet to take shape in developing countries like India. What we do have, though, are local audiences which are largely urban in their character. These local audiences function as social groups within the unstructured larger groups, directly influencing the interactions with the mass media. The local audiences in India have a dynamic of their own. The pulls and pressures of family, caste, community, religion, profession all have their say and is much stronger than any power brandished by the mass media. With such groups, it is not easy to establish a new way of thinking or a new way of life, except maybe at a very surface level. However, during the 1940s and the 1950s, there was a significant turnaround in the history of mass communication theory. The atomistic conception of the mass audience was questioned by researchers like Katz and Laserfeld. Research acknowledged the existence of the group, claiming it had never disappeared, holding on even in the face of seemingly unfavorable conditions of the Industrial Revolution. It is safe to presume that no man is an island. In fact, he is not a member of one group alone, but of many groups. He keeps moving from one group to another all through his life. The social group could be the family, the community, his college group, some political party, professional association, and so on. And hence, no matter how strong-willed an individual is, the pressure of one's group is bound to shape his attitude, his values, opinions, and his beliefs. Groups are a vital social reality from which there is little escape. They, much more than the mass media, are responsible for change as well as resistance to change. Pointers were found to support the notion that in reality, audiences were made up of many overlapping networks of social relations based on their interests and possibly locality. The media themselves were built into these groups. Group leaders or opinion leaders play an important role in the behavior of the group. This notion of personal influence and opinion leader led to the belief that contact with the media was mediated by a variety of social contacts who served to guide, filter, and interpret contact with the media and its message. On the face of it, the collective and social group character of audiences was confirmed. Yet, the idea equating mass audience with a faceless and influential mass never lost its teeth.
Now, the future of mass audiences is a very interesting one, because people have now started questioning whether we should look at audiences as mass audiences or as niche audiences. So, there are numbers who have a specific kind of media taste and therefore are consuming a certain kind of mass media product, but will these numbers continue to be as large as they were, or can we look at them as undifferentiatedly as we did in the past? The answer to that perhaps is no. Audiences today are interacting with each other. There are various opportunities because of the digital world, and therefore perhaps audiences are now returning to the role of what was classically defined as the public. There is greater collectivization around a particular idea, and there is a tendency to arrive at a particular decision. This decision-making collective conscience was associated with the idea of the public, which generated concepts and opinions. Audiences traditionally were not supposed to be creating that kind of feedback or those kinds of opinions. But today audiences, as they say, are more informed, they have greater means of providing feedback, and there is greater dialogue. And therefore perhaps audiences will shrink in terms of conventional definitions, but become more and more diverse, more and more proactive, and therefore lead to perhaps greater accountability on the part of producers of media.
Hence, we find that there has never really been an appropriate word that could define the receivers of mass communication in all its correctness. Each general term or word used is just a suggestion or an implication. These suggestions are not quite appropriate in the way that they are either too narrow or too wide or just too value-laden. Another word that currently holds sway is the media market. Media companies use the word to describe a set of media consumers or the target group of media advertisers. In other words, moving on from the audience as a group to audience as a mass. Here the audience is equated with a market. While the concept is simply practical for commercial media industries, its use implies a negative undertone and reflects the critique of the mass, since the media as a market has many characteristics similar to the audience as a mass. So this brings us to the end of this chapter dedicated towards understanding the nature of the mass media audience. So more in the next lesson. Bye for now.